This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Corenna and Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Joining us now in studio is Maine State Auditor and Democratic candidate for Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Matt Dunlap. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thanks for inviting me back.
We appreciate it.
It must not have been too bad last time.
You did a great job last time, and we're glad to have you this time.
Speaking of last time, we have the new extensive Single Audit Report here in front of us. From your perspective, is this audit better, worse, or about the same as the prior one?
They're all neutral. They're all different. And let's get into what an audit is, what an audit is not. I've had now so much experience introducing people to this process because I knew very little about it before I got elected auditor. And that's well documented. Everybody knows I was completely categorically unqualified to be state auditor when I was elected, having never taken so much as a high school bookkeeping class. So I go back to that point. And I've had this conversation with people in town meetings who are very concerned about their town finances. And maybe there's something that was not uncovered in an audit, that they're not really buying what the auditors and the staff are saying. And I had asked the question, when you hear the word audit, what is your first emotional response? Typically, it's fear. Because you think of tax audits. Oh, I'm in trouble. And when you're being audited, you think you're in trouble. And that's what people associate an audit with is, oh, there's something wrong. Somebody must be in trouble. They've done something wrong and now they're going to get caught. And actually, as I went through the entire training protocol around becoming a certified internal auditor, is something I had to kind of absorb this repeated mantra that the purpose of an audit is to improve an organization. And that doesn't fit to what your instinct is that something is wrong. And actually, what this work is, and the work's in past years, and we have years we've had 96 discrete findings, 85 discrete findings, 50 discrete findings, there's 71 in this audit document. Is that better, worse? It really doesn't matter because they're all different from each other. They all tell you something fairly significant. And the significant thing is you have an opportunity to improve a process and not just improve it, but make it right. What that really means is in the context of the different types of audits. We don't do performance audits like what you see the Office of Program Evaluation does. They will evaluate the performance of a program. Is this doing what was intended to do? That's a judgment. We don't do those types of judgments. Ours is very black and white. So out here, where we are in Bangor, you go out into the parking lot of one of the car dealerships. And if you're going to have an audit and you assert as a car dealer owner that you own 400 pickup trucks out there. You have the titles to them and everything. The auditor actually go out and count. They'll count, see if you actually have 400 trucks. Okay, that verifies the existence of the inventory that you claim to have. That's part of the audit. Now, the word audit is a Latin word. And it goes, we know what the auditory canal is in your ear, an auditorium. Well, that's the same thing. So let's just say go back to the ancient times and you deal in olive oil. And you're on the coastal city of Ostia in the Roman Empire, and you've paid a great deal of money for a shipload of olive oil, and they're coming in amphorae. And you want to make sure that what you've paid for is actually what's showing up on the ship. So you hire somebody who will put their ear against each one of them and tap a little hammer to see how full it is. They're listening. That's what an audit is. You listen to the assertions to see if they are actually something that can be verified. And it's not absolute. You do a lot of sampling. Like if you're going to do an audit of Amazon, they do billions of transactions. It would take 1,000 years to test every single transaction. So you do a lot of sampling. That's what we do too. The type of audit work that we do is split into 3 parts. We do financial audits, which you assert your financial statements say this, and we will test those transactions to see if they're reasonably accurate, give a reasonable assurance to the users of those documents that they can rely on those documents. That if the state says that it generated so many $1 billion in tax revenues, that's accurate. And if they expended so many $1 billion in expenditures, that's also accurate. State police say they have 600 cruisers. You go out and you count the 600 cruisers. So that's fairly simple to get your head around. We also do fraud examinations. So when there's an allegation of fraud or misuse or misconduct of state resources, we will go in and we will do an audit. And there's also lots of discussion around the standard audit versus the forensic audit. I won't get into that right now because there is a distinction there. But if we corroborate that, you go in and you ask questions, and if you get an answer to your question, that's great. But if that question, that the answer begets more questions, you keep asking those additional questions until you say, none of this adds up, none of it makes sense. And then you can see where the paper trail goes. And then you can assert that actually there is a substantiated allegation of misconduct. And then you turn that over to law enforcement. we're not a law enforcement agency. This document that's in front of us right now in the studio, the Single Audit Report, that's a phrase that doesn't mean an awful lot to the average citizen because they don't think in terms of different types of audits. The single audit was an act passed by Congress in the 1980s, the Single Audit Act, because you have all these federal agencies that get appropriations from Congress to do certain things that they cannot possibly execute on their own. So they send the money to the states, and sometimes the states will give money in contracts to nonprofits and to other entities to do that same work. But there are criteria for utilizing those resources. You just don't take a stack of money and say, okay, let's go buy a hayfield. If the money is meant, say, for Medicaid, Medicaid's an easy one because oftentimes there's income criteria that they have to follow, even age thresholds, that sort of thing. So the audit is to make sure they're actually applying those criteria to the expenditures of the money. So we test those transactions. And you kind of set a certain deviation rate that you would expect to find that maybe somebody forgot to check a box or they forgot to sign off on an invoice. But if you see things that exceed those thresholds, you may communicate with the entity and say, look, we're starting to see stuff over and over and over again that could result in a finding of a deficiency or a weakness. And what those things mean is that they're not in compliance with those criteria, that it could jeopardize future federal funds. It may lead to question costs. It may even result in the federal government asking for the money back, which has happened in the past. If you have like a material weakness, and materiality is a very serious condition. And the best way to explain it is if you win the lottery and you have $10 million and you decide you want to create a fund to help students go to college, and you want to invest that money in the stock market, under federal law, every publicly traded company has to put their balance sheets online so you can see where their money comes from, where it goes, statement of cash flows, income statements, retained earnings, and the balance sheets. Now, if there's something in those documents that was inaccurate, that would affect your decision on whether or not to invest in that company, that is a material misstatement, that type of thing. Materiality is actually a definable word, which much of the language of audit is so understated that it's hard to really know what you're talking about when you hear about significant deficiency versus material weakness. One is more severe than the other, but unless you know that, oh, wow, significant deficiency. So what? So we go through all the major programs, which there's a formula for determining what constitutes a major program, or programs that the feds themselves designate as high risk. Like Medicaid's a high risk program because there's so much money going in so many directions. They want to make sure that we audit it every year just to make sure that there's a reasonable assurance of those things. So to answer the question, is it better, more or less? It's a different year. And we actually will rotate audit staff through. So somebody who gets really good at Medicaid may only do it for 2 or 3 years because we want a fresh set of eyes looking at that sort of thing. It's a fairly comprehensive look at how these programs are performing. And like I say, the point is, if we find that there are deficiencies, the purpose of the audit as a tool is for the custodians of those programs to look at those deficiencies and our suggestions and recommendations and say, okay, this is how we fix this going forward. You will find in this document, and I do tend to have a lot of run-on sentences and I apologize, but you will find that oftentimes a reported cause is a lack of supervisory oversight. That can mean a lot of different things. It can mean they can't find qualified people to run the program, or someone who has been doing it for 40 years has retired and they have a new person that isn't quite up to speed, or the program has changed and they're trying to figure out the rules as they go along. And a lot of that comes out through walkthroughs, because we actually do walkthroughs. We'll walk through a process and a flow chart with the people who are actually doing the work. What we will find is when we say, well, the criteria says this, but this is what we're looking at. It's like, nobody told me I had to do that. So that's a lack of supervisory oversight. And we need to spend more time on that. So it's sort of an invitation for them to do a better job running the programs. That's what the audit is supposed to be.
Well, speaking of programs, correct me if I'm wrong, but 10 of the 13 major programs were in noncompliance. How significant is that?
Not insignificant. I don't think it's anything that should cause people to lay awake at night. I mean, these are massive programs with hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. And one of the audit findings, and actually came up this week, I was in front of the Government Oversight Committee getting my hair trimmed by the administration, as it were. And they brought up a finding from last year on procurement and contracts. And that was one that was very much in the public eye for a couple of different reasons. And I can kind of explain that because I actually did bring that old finding with me because I happen to carry these things around. So in this one, we start with the criteria, what the federal government and state law call for. And then the next thing that comes in the finding is the condition. That's what we find. One of the things that we found that procurement justification forms, which have to be signed before you start a contract, we found 18 of 31 that we tested were signed after the contract start date. We had 24 of 45 contracts tested were signed after the contract start date. We had there's something called a low-cost contract. Those are contracts that come in under a threshold whereby you'd have to put it out to RFP, like $5,000 or up needs an RFP before you can issue it. Anything under $5,000, you can just award, but there's a component in there that a vendor can only have one of those per agency per year. So we found last year that state procurement did not review existing low-cost contracts prior to approval of new contracts to the same vendor. And of the 7 that we tested, 4 were to vendors already engaged in more than one with a department within the same 12-month period, which is prohibited by state policy. One department had 7 concurrent LCSCs with the same vendor. Is that dangerous? Not necessarily. Doesn't mean that, well, they're obviously breaking policy. Were they stealing anything? No. But what that provision is meant to prevent is a circumvention of the RFP rule, that you stack these low-cost contracts into something that becomes modular, what could be considered a contract that should be put out to bid. One of the things we have to emphasize on this, because it's a question we get a lot, especially from legislators, is does this constitute fraud? And the answer is no. It's a lack of oversight. It's obviously not following the compliance rules. Doesn't mean anybody's stealing. Again, a fraud complaint is someone intentionally trying to conceal grabbing something for themselves by surreptitious means. And we just wrapped up. It's wrapping up. There's going to be a sentencing here in the middle of May. We did a fraud investigation, which I may have mentioned the last time I was here, misuse of a procurement card, which is the modern day version of petty cash, the P card. You have a credit card. Every office has one. They have a threshold that you can't go above. And we decided to do some testing of procurement cards because we have access to every transaction in state government. And we put a senior auditor on it and say, hey, see how agencies are doing complying with this. And this one card kept popping up at the very top of the range, like $49.96, $49.97, $49.95 and change, sometimes every other day. And we ran into some brick walls. We could only go so far. So we enlisted the help of the Attorney General's office. They got search warrants and subpoenas, and they were able to determine in the end, substantiate an allegation that this person had an accomplice in Florida, and they were basically stealing state money with a procurement card, sending it to Florida, and then getting a kickback on PayPal. The individuals pled guilty and will be sentenced, I think, in the middle of May. That is deliberate fraud. Not signing a purchase order on time is not necessarily fraud. It just puts things at risk. And when we talk about the risk piece of this in the context of this year's audit, where we really fought with the administration behind closed doors, was we were looking at their policy manuals, which are completely outdated. They said, we don't even use those anymore. We have all these other things we use. So it's like, well, if it's not centralized, it makes it disjointed. So whether you're a vendor or the person overseeing the contract, you have to look at all these different places for this memoranda and that flow chart, and things stretch out over time, which causes these things to be signed after start dates, sometimes signed after the work's been completed, or they issue a notice of intent for a sole source contract after it's already in the works, which exposes the state to risk. First of all, you're incurring a liability that you haven't signed for. But what if you have one of these, say a contract on leases of police cruisers, and you're going to go with Ford, and we're just going to go ahead and do this. We're going to sole source it because that's what we always use. Well, what if the Chevy dealer down the road gets wind of that, wants to bid on it? If there's litigation, the state could be exposed to litigation risk at an unknown level. So we're all about mitigating risk. And that's why these processes are in place. And that's what you see in some of the audit work.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a discussion with Maine State Auditor and Democratic candidate for Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Matt Dunlap. As you know, MaineCare has been at the center of both audit findings and fraud concerns. What is your overall assessment of the program today?
I'll tell you that the Human Services Department typically occupies the lion's share of our audit findings year over year. And that's not because they're incompetent. I wouldn't say that at all, or they're not dedicated or they don't care. Sometimes they care almost a little bit too much. I think more attributable is it's a very, very big agency managing many complex programs. And like any agency, they have their own levels of turnover. One of the things that I observed as Secretary of State was that, and this is at the lower level, this is not at the program manager level, but pay scales have not kept up. And 20 years ago, $14.85 was a great starting wage, but they're still starting people at $14.85, and they can start more at McDonald's now with 401ks and college tuition assistance. And so what happens is that people come in, they get hired, they're successful, they go through their 6-month probationary period as a customer associates 1, $14.85 an hour. What's the first thing they do after they get their 6 months? They look for something else. They try to find something that's $18 an hour, or $20 an hour. And the danger to agencies is that it really throws off things like succession planning. Who's going to be the next section manager? who's going to be the next director, the next deputy secretary of state, because you don't have anyone coming up because they get to a certain threshold and they peel off for greener pastures. And that's not confined to any one agency. That's across state government. I think certainly Human Services go through that. When we would hire people at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, we'd have an employee orientation. And I was always interested to see where people were coming from. We used to get a lot of folks from Riverview who'd work at Riverview for a few years and just get burnt and go to something where dealing with people who have been convicted of operating under the influence is easy compared to some of these other things that they've been grappling with. And I think in some of the programs, and I have not spoken with folks within Human Services, but I can imagine that some of the work is extraordinarily difficult and creates turnover, not only at the lower levels, but also at the higher levels. You get programmatic burnout. Our challenge as auditors is that we can't make an allowance for that. We can't say, well, geez, David Quirk is a great guy. He's doing a hell of a job under terrible circumstances, 70% turnover every 2 years. He's always training new employees. We recommend that we give him a break. Well, we can't. It's in material noncompliance, material weakness, question costs. And like I say, if the agencies followed our recommendations to heart, they'd take these findings and wave them around their head like bloody shirts and say to the legislature, we need help here. We need higher pay scales. We need incentives for retention and that sort of thing. But I think human nature being what it is, I think a lot of the people that we interact with are extraordinarily proud of what they do. They're proud of who they serve and how they help people. And when they see these audit findings, I think it kind of makes them clench a little bit. And I understand why. So it creates that natural tension between us and state agencies when really we're just trying to point out ways that they can do better.
So one in particular, the audit shows that there were 88 nursing facility uniform desk reviews that were due in the fiscal year 2025, but 0 had been completed at the time of testing. Mm-hmm. How serious of a breakdown is that?
All these are fairly serious. We wouldn't go to the trouble of issuing a material weakness, material noncompliance finding if it wasn't serious. There's a reason why you do those desk reviews, and that's to make sure that the conditions that are expected are actually being upheld and inspected. So the actual criteria, without going through all the bureaucratic piece, the Division of Audit's requirements for reviewing the cost reports and performing uniform desk reviews is also outlined. Section 67 states the Division of Audit must perform a uniform desk review on each nursing facility cost report submission within 365 days of receipt of an acceptable cost report filing. Now, that's the Division of Audit within Human Services, not us. So what we found was that the Division of Audit did not complete these audits in accordance with federal regulations. The population of uniform desk reviews due for completion in fiscal year 2025 was 88. Of those 88 uniform desk reviews, none were completed at the time of audit testing in October 2025. What do we have as a cause? Lack of resources. They don't have enough people. Bottom line. Now, the effect is noncompliance with federal and state regulations. The determination of amounts owed to or from the nursing facilities is delayed. So that puts them in a bind because you can't pay them until you know whether or not they've passed their desk audit. Now, here's the key thing about this finding. The management's response to this, the department agrees with this finding. They agree that that's a problem. And that's really, really important because a lot of our work sometimes comes out and about when they disagree. And then we have to say, well, you may disagree, but this is what the federal criteria says. This is what state law says. And the law has been changed now that for many, many years, if an agency disagreed with a finding, that was kind of it. Unless the federal government said, we agree with the state auditor and you need to have a corrective action plan, which does happen more frequently than people see. But there's already a corrective action plan in place that they put on file. They understand that this is something they need to address. In this case, this audit tool is going to be successfully used. It may take a while because remember now we're already in to the next fiscal year. We are 9 months into the next fiscal year and the audit's just been completed from the last fiscal year. So you may see this finding again next year, but it may not be as severe. They may have had some chance by that time to mitigate. And certainly the audit work itself, as we point out things and we ask questions and they identify things they need to do better, they may already be doing corrective action in the middle of all this. In a typical private sector audit, even if you point something out as an auditor, it's like, oh, that's not right. They fix it. You still have to report it in the audit, even if it's been corrected, so that the user knows that there was a problem that was corrected. There's no way out of the labyrinth. I mean, once you get the finding sticks.
The issue with nursing homes, as we know, they run on such a very thin line of revenue, if any, that if they're going to lose funds because of this, that's a problem.
It's a huge problem. And I think this is, again, the purpose of doing the audit. If you don't have that audit document, you don't know that's happening. And this is one of the things that we emphasize to legislators about that law change that was just effected a couple of years ago. I was on the legislature for 8 years. This document would show up on our desk at the beginning of every April. Now, My last term, I was on 3 committees. I chaired 2 of them. And I didn't have time to go through all this, and I didn't know what it meant. So that would sit on my desk until adjournment, and then I'd take it home and give it to the local library. Legislators are citizens. They are not experts. When I first got elected to the Maine House of Representatives, I was working 2 full-time jobs. I was proofreading at the University of Maine Printing Services shop, and I was the bar manager at Pat's Pizza. They put me on the Fish and Wildlife Committee. I didn't know anything about fish and wildlife policy, conservation law. I learned a lot, but that was my committee. But then you had banking and insurance. You had utilities and energy. You had business and economic development, all with their own jargons, their own policies, their own histories. And you come to rely on each other a lot as legislators. It's like, hey, Corenna, you're on business services. I see this bill on the calendar. What can you tell me about it? So they do come to rely on each other a lot. But then this gets completely lost, because legislators can only really know sometimes what they're told. So this law change that we would bring disagreements in findings, we tell the committees, you can invite us to come and we'll talk about it. The agency can come and say why they disagree. So the legislators themselves can see what's going on and determine for themselves whether they need to take additional action, whether they need to find more resources or redevelop a program or rewrite the laws in some way. And especially in the era of term limits, that makes this document much, much more important.
With the amount of alleged fraud in issues we're seeing, who should be held responsible?
Well, I think, in terms of who is responsible for all of it, it's the elected officials, ultimately, that are charged with governance. That really means the governor of the state of Maine. The governor of the state of Maine does not run the Medicaid clusters or the nursing home audit reviews, desk reviews, but ultimately they are responsible for it. And I think that's something I know. I've served with Angus King, Paul LePage, John Baldacci, Janet Mills, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. They all take it pretty seriously. It's a curious telescoping of responsibility that state government has taken on, especially since the 1930s, as government has become more important to people's daily lives and has grown. As people need more services, regulation is required, and you see it in your work. If you look at the whole history of, the work that I was familiar with as Secretary of State, it's all consumer protection stuff. And the work that you do in the private sector is you have a tremendous reputation. But we've seen folks that didn't have such great reputations, where people were grievously harmed because they were sold a car that the seller didn't actually own. And then a tow truck would show up and they come take it away because the money that you were paying for it wasn't going to the entity that originally owned the vehicle. We used to call that floor planning. So you develop a law around that, and you have a regulatory infrastructure, and those things grow outwards as the needs change. And that spans across government. And it's very, very difficult to get a handle on these. When you get into the microfibers, if you will, 88 nursing homes doesn't sound like a microfiber, but it really is when you got the context of an $11 billion enterprise. Who is responsible for that? Everyone's responsible for it. It's like when I was interviewed for a job as a supervisor once, somebody said, who would you think that you work for in this position? I said, honestly, I work for the guy that cuts the grass as much as I would work for the head person or the board of trustees. And if you approach it that way as a government employee, that you work for everyone, you take this sort of thing much more seriously, I think, than say, well, somebody was asleep at the switch. That's not good enough. And that's not what the public really expects. They want to know what is being done to fix this. And not just who's going to get fired. You may have somebody who's just an incredible person doing their very, very best. But if you look at their workflow chart, it's Lucille Ball in the candy factory. You wonder why they even show up. They're so busy and they can't possibly manage everything they have to manage. That was one of the things that we found in contract management. Just within human services, never mind all of contracts, $2.5 billion in state and federal revenues going into contracts. They had in human services like 2 or 3 people trying to keep a handle on the execution of 2,000 different contracts. How do you do it? You could barely have time to date stamp the stuff at that point. And let's talk about responsibility. If you're someone in that position, I think you do have an affirmative responsibility to say, I need help. This is not working. And one of the things the legislature did, and we've inherited this, is something called the fraud hotline. I laugh at it every time we come up with it. It started out as a whistleblower protection statute. That when people were saying, look, this program isn't working right, or the money isn't being spent well, we didn't want them to be retaliated against. And the legislature entertained legislation, they passed it, and somehow they amended it into this fraud hotline where people can anonymously, in fact, we can't even verify that we've gotten a fraud complaint from someone, whether someone is stealing or a program is being run inefficiently. It's sort of a whistleblower type thing. And unfortunately, we need something like that because human nature, we're in the human nature business when you're talking about this type of work. And I think it's part of the human nature of a supervisor to protect themselves. And if somebody's complaining about things not running well, they're going to look for somebody to blame, to hold accountable, when really they should be listening to that person and say, okay, tell me what your ideas are and let's get to work. Ultimately, in state government, it's the executive that's ultimately responsible for the conduct of all of these programs. And then every tier below that has their own share of that responsibility. One of the things I learned as a line cook is that my job as a cook was to help the chef. The chef was responsible for every plate of food that went out the door, and my job was to help them. It wasn't just to cut celery, it's to make him look good. Make sure that he got the quality he was expecting on every plate of food that went to every customer.
Now, would that be the commissioners?
That would be the commissioners, program directors, deputy commissioners. You have section managers, group supervisors, right down to that customer service associate one, the person that actually interacts with the public. They have a responsibility here too. Anyone who holds any public trust, and that's somebody who unlocks the door, someone who puts the mail in the mail bin. That's a public trust. I think it's a rather solemn and sacred thing, frankly.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a discussion with Maine State Auditor and Democratic candidate for Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Matt Dunlap. Since the last audit and the attention it received, has the procurement process improved at all?
It still has a lot of significant problems. I can't say that it was a significant improvement. But again, I mean, when we issued that audit from the 2024 fiscal year, that was at the end of March, 9 months into this past fiscal year that we also have completed the audit for. So you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a vast improvement. Now, we do see some improvement. And this was the crux of the argument that we had in front of the Government Oversight Committee the other day. We had a finding, it was a bridge finding between the financial audit and the compliance audit around procurement and contracts around the very same issues we talked about in 2024. The real issue was around the resources that people were expected to make use of. One of the things that they were really pinning our ears back a little bit, saying that we were not using the right resources to do our audit from. They had an operations manual and program policies operations manual from 2015. And they said, well, that's outdated. We don't use that. And I said, well, that's the source that we're supposed to be auditing against. Well, we have all these other memoranda. We have other flow charts. We have other guides that we use. And it's so disjointed. It's all over the place. So as part of their disagreement with our finding on this, they said the reference 2015 manual is no longer authoritative. It has been superseded by multiple policies, procedures, training materials, and organizational changes implemented through subsequent OSPS reorganizations and decentralization of functions. As such, the condition cited in the finding does not represent noncompliance with current requirements. So our response to that was, OSPS has repeatedly stated that the 2015 Purchasing Policy and Operations Manual is no longer authoritative. However, despite multiple requests during the audit, OSPS did not provide a successor comprehensive policy document that replaces the PPOM and provides consolidated mapping of applicable state and federal procurement requirements to current OSPS policies, procedures, and assigned responsibilities. In addition, while OSPS references multiple policies, trainings, and organizational changes implemented since 2015, there is no evidence that these changes have been formally communicated in a unified method to departments and agencies. This is the bureaucratic, polite way of having a food fight. We had another 8 findings on procurement. So let's just pull one up, if we may. This is another finding on another procurement component of the other 8 that we issued this spring. This is their response. The department agrees with this finding. The OSPS does not authorize, encourage, or approve agencies allowing vendors to perform work at risk. Then further down, to address these concerns, OSPS will formalize and issue policy guidance that clearly defines agency and OSPS roles and responsibilities in the contracting process. This guidance will expand the agency-focused section to emphasize timely submission and processing, along with the risks and implications associated with contract delays. So they are going to centralize it after all. Now, what I said to the committee is that I would call that progress.
Out of the program failures, the big ones were SNAP, child nutrition, summer EBT, TANF, foster care adoption, disaster grants, and education grants. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
The common issues were eligibility, allowable costs, reporting, and subrecipient monitoring.
Yeah, subrecipient monitoring, let's start with that. What that really is you are the Department of Health and Human Services, and you have, say, a program to provide hot lunches to kids during the summer when they're not in school. So there's eligibility criteria they're supposed to be following, all that sort of thing. Now, Human Services is not going to set up a cafeteria. So it's going to be devolved to another entity, maybe a school district. The school district gets the money, and they're supposed to be monitoring to make sure that the kids that are getting that service are eligible for it, that they're not bundling too many kids into a program that may not be eligible. Are they actually residents? The department doesn't do that work. The school is supposed to do it. So subrecipient monitoring means, is the department checking to make sure the school is actually documenting all this work? And if they're not, that's a lack of subrecipient monitoring that will almost certainly generate a finding. Because then it's just money going out the door and you don't know if it's being used as it was intended to be. What we know about things like SNAP and EBT and all these other types of programs is that the clientele is very diffuse. They're everywhere with all different sets of circumstances. Yes, there are thresholds that are supposed to be met. And are they actually checking on that? That's why you see so many findings around these particular issues, simply because the programs themselves, the implementation of them is so complicated. I think it was last year, the year before, we did question costs for all EBT cards because they didn't have any records on who'd gotten them. It wasn't that it had been done wrong, but we couldn't verify anything. So that was a finding because we have to have something to audit against. And if they don't have the records, we have nothing to audit against.
What is the percentage of your audit? So you're just taking a very small percentage.
It varies. It's a non-statistical random sample. One of the things that was very frustrating, I know, to the administration last year on that procurement audit, and I keep going back to that, that was what was in the press for months. That was the context that was waved around like a bloody shirt. I use that analogy quite a bit, as you notice. $2.1 billion in contracts. And there were outlets in the press that said the state could be misspending $2.1 billion. Well, was $2.1 billion really being misspent, going out the back door in a black satchel? Not necessarily. But when you look at the contracts that we did sample, we sampled like 45 contracts that were probably worth about, $47 million. We found a bunch of things wrong. So if you extrapolate that to the full population, it's a risk. So here's an analogy. Again, I worked in restaurants for so many years. So you have a restaurant, you close at 11 o'clock, and you leave a cigar box on the bar with all the cash in it from the night. You don't lock the doors and you leave lights on. Now, if you come back the next day and it's still there, then nothing's gone wrong, correct? But there's a risk that someone could walk in off the street, pick up the box of money, and walk out with it. So what we're really testing here is internal controls, which we kind of skipped over all of this, but that's what we're testing. If you have a control that if you are supposed to make sure that people are actually alive before they get benefits, that is a control. Now, if they don't actually check that, then they have not utilized the control and the control is completely neutralized. That's what we're really testing. Are the controls effective or are they being bypassed? Are they being overridden? And that's something that when you have true fraud investigations, that can be a cause, is overriding of internal controls or a bypassing of internal controls. Like that fraud examination we did a couple of years ago, it was a deputy superintendent telling his subordinates, just give that stuff to me and I'll approve it. He was bypassing every control. And he had a partner on the outside that was collusion. And sometimes fraud can be very hard to detect if more than one person is working together to defraud something. That's the risk. It's not at all a fact that $2.1 billion is being stolen, but the controls were not mitigating the risks, and the risks are still there.
And with this single audit, what was reviewed? Was it $6 billion in federal funds? I do see that there was $650,000 of question cost. What's the number on this one?
So question costs varies a little bit, and it's not necessarily, again, that money was misspent. It's if you don't document. This is one that we found, sole source contracting. If you weren't having a properly documented review, maybe they were reviewing it, but they didn't document what they were reviewing. That puts them out of compliance, and that could bring the costs that were spent into question. A question cost can be something we know they spent the money wrong. We did a finding a few years ago during COVID, I know it was one of the COVID findings, where a school district had used COVID money to buy like a 12-place ATV for like $30,000 with the stated purpose of ferrying athletes from the gymnasium to the playing fields. Now, I was an athlete. That was part of the deal. You ran. And we questioned that, and they disagreed with us. But then the Inspector General of the United States said we were right, and they had to sell the ATV and send the money back to the federal government. To your point, where is the accountability? It does pop up from time to time. And again, they're not going to put that on the headline of the school newsletter, but they're going to follow the requirement. So the question is, what is the monetary value of what we review? Ultimately, everything is under our purview. Now, we do a lot of sampling, but basically, we can review any expenditure in state government up to the full value of the $11 billion. Now, about half of that, about $5.5 billion, is federal money that comes down. But we're empowered to do town audits. Don't tell anybody that we can do town audits because they're all going to want us to do their audits. And by the way, we're not cheaper than an accounting firm. We're more expensive because we do a different type of job, more thorough. Don't tell the accounting firms we do a more thorough job. We're not looking for more work. We only have 37 positions, but we can audit anything to do with any public spending in the state of Maine. And that includes the county level, town level, state, federal. In terms of the single audit, the compliance audit is really focused on that $5.5 billion of federal money, but a lot of state money is also swirled together with that. And certainly the financial statement audit, the annual comprehensive financial report audit that we do in the fall, encompasses all of that. So we touch everything eventually.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 with Maine State Auditor and Democratic candidate for Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Matt Dunlap. Make sure to tune in tomorrow, Sunday, April 12th at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, The Voice of Maine. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.